Today we're diving deep into, well, a conflict that's still going on, sadly. The Israel-Hamas war.
Yeah.
It's been, everywhere in the news. But we want to go deeper than just the headlines.
Yeah.
Really try to understand the human cost, the impact on the whole region, and how it's affecting the entire world.
That's so important with a conflict like this. It's so easy to just get caught up in the day-to-day, but this, I think, lets us take a step back and see how everything fits together. It's a very complex story.
Yeah. It says the conflict started back on October 7th, 2023, with Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups launching a surprise attack on Israel.
Right. And then that attack triggered a large-scale Israeli invasion of Gaza, which, sadly, as we know, is still going on now in January 2025. It's just become this really drawn-out conflict with no easy end in sight.
It definitely feels like we've been hearing about this war forever.
Exactly. You've got Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad on one side, and then, Hezbollah in Lebanon is involved. Iran has a big influence too, sort of in the background. And then there's Israel and, well, their allies, especially the United States.
A lot of competing interests.
Yeah, it's all tangled up.
And it really seems like the people caught in the middle are the ones paying the price. The reports, especially from the Lancet and Human Rights Watch, they really highlight the death toll in Gaza. It's just staggering.
Yeah, the numbers are horrific. Right now, it's over 46,000 reported deaths in Gaza. And what's even more heartbreaking is that more than half of those people, those casualties, are women and children.
Wow, that's just, I don't even know what to say. It's unimaginable.
Yeah.
And it's not just the number of deaths either. That Lancet report says those official numbers, they might be underestimating the true scale.
Yeah, they estimate the real number of deaths directly caused by injuries could be closer to 70,000.
Oh, wow.
That difference just shows how difficult it is to track these things during a conflict, especially somewhere like Gaza, where it's hard to get access for, observers and aid groups.
It's just a reminder that behind the numbers, these are real people, each with their own story and families and dreams, that have been destroyed by this war. And then on top of the deaths, there's the injuries.
Right. Over 100,000 Palestinians have been injured. And it's just a terrible situation. So many injuries, not enough medical care. Gaza now has the highest rate of child amputees in the world.
Oh, that's awful. Okay, so it's not looking good. What else do our sources say about the situation in Gaza? What's it like there?
Well, besides those casualties, Gaza's facing a huge humanitarian crisis. It's a full-blown crisis. Israel tightened the blockade, so it's hard to get essential supplies in. Food, fuel, medicine, you name it.
So what are the consequences of that?
Well, the sources paint a pretty grim picture. Not enough food means a hunger crisis. Some areas are basically facing famine.
Oh, that's just terrible. And then without fuel or electricity, I can't imagine what that's like.
The lack of fuel has caused a massive drop in electricity. They say it's down by 90%, which impacts everything. Hospitals, sanitation systems, everything.
90%. It's almost like the whole region is in the dark. What about clean water?
The reports on that are very concerning. Daily water availability per person has fallen to, well, less than a third of what's recommended, even in emergency situations.
So not only are people having trouble finding food, but they're also facing dehydration and disease. It's just a cascade of awful consequences. I remember the sources talking about the impact on communication, too, and infrastructure.
Right. The destruction of crucial infrastructure has been a major part of this war. Not just damage to buildings, but telecommunications, hospitals, schools, they've all been targeted. It's not just limiting aid and information, it's disrupting basic services.
So it sounds like they're trying to completely cripple Gaza, not just militarily, but as a whole society.
And that's where the concept of domicide comes in. Some experts are using it to describe this kind of destruction. It's basically destroying a place to make it uninhabitable.
Wow. That's a chilling thought. But is there evidence to support that? Or is it just collateral damage?
Well, look at the scale of the destruction. The bombing of buildings in Gaza has surpassed the combined damage from Dresden, Hamburg, and London in World War II.
Wow.
They estimate that something like 50% to 62% of buildings have been damaged or destroyed. And it's not just houses, it's roads, greenhouses, even tree crops.
Yeah, and I remember those sources talked about the cost of rebuilding. It was astronomical.
It's something like 42 million tons of rubble. And clearing that could cost over $80 billion. And it could take, some experts say, up to 80 years.
80 years?
Yeah. It's a pretty daunting task, and it makes you wonder about the future of Gaza.
The situation in Gaza just sounds horrible. Those images, It's hard to imagine going through something like that.
Yeah, it's just devastating. And all those numbers we were talking about, those statistics, it just highlights the human cost of this war. But this whole thing has become really controversial internationally, too.
Right, it's gone way beyond Israel and Gaza. We've seen those huge pro-Palestinian protests all over the world, and there's some very serious accusations being made, even genocide against Israel.
Yeah, and those accusations have led to action, too, like the International Criminal Court issuing arrest warrants for leaders on both sides.
Oh, wow.
It's a big deal, you know? It shows that people are taking those allegations seriously.
So what have the major world powers been saying about this? It seems like people are taking sides.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of condemnation of Israel, especially from countries in the Islamic world, and, you know, they call the global south. But then you have the Western powers, the US, UK, Germany, they're still supporting Israel.
And the U.S. seems to be getting a lot of criticism for its role. I'm thinking about their veto power at the UN.
Oh, yeah. The US has used that veto power a few times to block resolutions for a ceasefire. Some people see that as like a double standard, like the US is protecting Israel.
It's a mess. All these political games, but it's the people on the ground suffering.
That's often the case, unfortunately. But, you know, while we've been focused on Gaza, this war has really affected Israel too.
Right. It's important to acknowledge all the victims. We can't just focus on one side. It's clear the casualty numbers are way lower in Israel, but this war has still affected them deeply.
Yes, definitely. And the sources that talk about the Israeli side, they really highlight the emotional toll, the constant fear of attacks, the disruptions, those sirens going off. It's created a climate of anxiety.
Yeah, I read about those sirens. Imagine having to run for shelter all the time, never knowing when the next attack is coming.
And the sources point out that it's especially hard on kids. They're growing up with this constant threat. It's hard to imagine what the long-term effects will be.
So what do the sources say about the Israeli casualties?
Yeah.
I know the numbers are lower than in Gaza, but it's still important.
Right. Well, the reports say Israel has suffered, expert speaker checks source casualties. And that includes the civilians from those Hamas attacks on October 7th, as well as those killed by Hezbollah rockets from Lebanon. And sadly, it also includes those killed by friendly fire, like that incident where the IDF accidentally killed Israeli hostages during an operation.
That's awful. It's a reminder that war is just so unpredictable and that terrible mistakes can happen.
Yeah, and within Israel, the response to the war has been complicated. You have a lot of public support for the military because, you know, they want security, they feel vulnerable.
Makes sense. So how has the Israeli government been dealing with this?
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very vocal about his goals. He wants to, and I quote here, destroy Hamas, demilitarize Gaza, and de-radicalize the whole of Palestinian society.
Those are pretty ambitious goals.
Yeah. And to try and achieve those, the Knesset, their parliament, has passed some pretty controversial laws. Some people are worried about those laws, that they could lead to more problems, infringe on people's rights.
So there's tension within Israel as well, trying to balance security with individual freedoms.
Absolutely. And it's not just Gaza either. We can't forget about the West Bank. I remember reading in those Amnesty International reports that things are getting worse there too, and it seems like the violence is different.
Right. Amnesty International was pretty critical in their report. They used the phrase chilling disregard for life to describe how Israeli settlers had been acting in the West Bank.
Yeah, that was a pretty strong statement.
So we're not just talking about the Israeli government here. It's civilians attacking Palestinians.
Yeah. The reports show that settler attacks have gone way up during this war, and a lot of them have been deadly.
That's scary.
Yeah. It just shows how deep the tension and anger runs, and it's not just limited to Gaza.
Yeah, those reports were tough to read. It's just a really dark picture of what's happening in the West Bank. And it shows how this war is impacting Palestinians in so many ways.
Absolutely. And then, on top of everything else, we have to consider Iran.
Right. They're a big part of this, too. What's their involvement been like?
Well, they've always supported Hamas, and they've been involved in this war in different ways. There have been reports of drone attacks on Israeli ships. And then, probably the most significant event, the assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran in 2024.
Yeah, that assassination was a turning point. It seemed like things got even more dangerous after that.
It really did. I mean, that led directly to a whole other conflict between Iran and Israel in 2024. Cyber attacks, retaliatory strikes, just a lot of tension.
And then the U.S. sent that Typhoon missile system to Israel.
Right. That was a big deal. It showed that they were worried about things getting out of control.
And then there were those leaked documents about Israel's plans to attack Iran.
Yeah, that was a big story. A lot of ethical and legal questions came up after that.
It's just a really tense situation.
It is. And with all of this happening, all this violence, we can't ignore the issue of war crimes.
Right. Both sides have been accused of some terrible things. Those are serious accusations.
They are. And Hamas has been condemned a lot for their tactics, using human shields, the rocket attacks on Israeli civilians, and of course the hostage-taking at the beginning of the war.
I remember those images from October 7th. Just the fear on people's faces as they were being taken away was really disturbing.
War brings out the worst in people. It strips away humanity and leaves so much trauma.
It's important to remember that Israel is also facing accusations for what they've done in Gaza.
Yeah. A lot of people are concerned about the intensity of the bombing, that maybe they used disproportionate force targeted civilians.
Those reports from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International talked about hospitals and schools being hit, even UN facilities.
Right. And that's where the debate about proportionality comes in. In war, you can't intentionally target civilians. And the evidence from Gaza is troubling.
Those images, the bombed out hospitals and schools, they're hard to forget.
Yeah. And it's not just the airstrikes either. There have been reports of mass detentions of Palestinian men, many of them held without any charges, and claims of mistreatment.
That's really worrying. It sounds like a situation where human rights are being violated.
It is. And Israel's use of administrative detention, where they can hold people indefinitely without trial, that's been controversial for a long time.
It doesn't seem very fair.
And then there's the whole issue of the blockade itself. Some experts argue that it's basically collective punishment, which is against international law.
Well, it's hard to disagree with that when you see how much suffering it's caused.
Exactly. It's made the humanitarian crisis so much worse. So now the question is, with all these accusations, will anyone be held accountable?
That's the big question, right? The International Criminal Court has issued warrants, but who knows if they'll actually be enforced.
It's a tough situation. It's also political. It's unlikely there will be trials anytime soon. But ignoring these issues just keeps the cycle of violence going.
Makes it harder to find peace.
Exactly. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about truth and reconciliation, recognizing everyone's suffering. That's how you start to build peace.
It's clear that there's so much more to this conflict than just what we're seeing now. The human cost, the global reaction, the accusation, it seems like all of that is just part of a bigger problem.
Right. And that's where those articles about the history of the conflict come in. To really understand this war, we have to look at the bigger picture, all those things that have led up to this over decades.
Yeah. So what are some of the key historical things that got us to this point?
Well, a lot of Palestinians see this war as part of a much longer struggle, one that goes all the way back to when Israel was created in 1948, what they call the Nakba.
Oh, right, the Nakba. I remember learning about that, the mass displacement of Palestinians. But how does that event that happened so long ago still affect things today?
Well, for many Palestinians, the Nakba represents this huge injustice. They lost their homes, their land, their livelihoods. It's a wound that hasn't healed.
Yeah.
And they see this war as just another part of that. More displacement, more suffering.
So that trauma, that feeling of loss, it's still very real for them.
Yeah.
And I imagine that fuels a lot of the anger towards Israel.
Absolutely. And then on the Israeli side, they have their own historical perspective. They've experienced persecution, violence from neighboring states.
Right. Israel has been in a lot of wars and conflicts since it was founded.
Yeah.
I could see how that would lead to a sense of, like, always being under threat.
Exactly. And that's why they often justify their actions, their policies, by talking about security, like the expansion of settlements in the West Bank.
Right. The settlements, it seems like every article mentions those. Why are they such a big issue?
Well, for Palestinians, they see it as Israel trying to take control of their land that they believe is rightfully theirs. And it makes it harder for them to imagine having their own state someday.
And it's not just about people living there, right? It affects resources, freedom of movement, all of that.
Exactly. The settlements often come with all this infrastructure, roads, water systems, security. And that makes it harder for Palestinians to get around, to access resources. It divides their communities.
It sounds like the settlements are making it almost impossible for Israelis and Palestinians to live together peacefully.
A lot of people believe that, and that's why, the international community sees them as illegal.
Okay. So, with all this history, all this mistrust, are there any solutions? Can this conflict ever end peacefully?
Well, that's the question everyone's asking. It's a really tough situation. But even the most difficult conflicts can be resolved if people are willing to work for peace.
So what are some of the ideas out there? for finding peace?
Well, the most common one is the two-state solution, creating a Palestinian state alongside Israel. That's been the basis of peace talks for a long time, but it's faced a lot of obstacles.
Yeah, it feels like that's getting harder to achieve, especially with the settlements.
Yeah, and that's why some people are starting to talk about other options, like maybe a one-state solution.
A one-state solution? What's that?
Basically, it would be one state for both Israelis and Palestinians. They would all be citizens with equal rights.
Wow. I don't know how that would work.
It would be a huge challenge. It would require a completely different way of thinking. People would have to let go of that, us versus them mentality.
So what are the arguments for and against that?
Well, people who support it say it's the only way to guarantee equal rights for everyone. It's the fairest solution, they say. And it would address those concerns about demographics, some Israelis wanting to maintain a Jewish majority.
Okay. What about the people who are against it?
They say it's just not realistic. They say it would lead to instability, maybe even civil war, and that it wouldn't really respect the identities of both Israelis and Palestinians.
It sounds like a complicated issue.
It is, and these are just two of the possible options. There might be other solutions, creative ideas that haven't even been thought of yet.
So what can we do? Regular people like me, how can we help?
I think the biggest thing is to stay informed. Read about it, listen to different perspectives, and talk about it with others, even if it's uncomfortable.
It's easy to feel powerless,
Yep.
With such a big conflict. But learning and talking about it is important.
Absolutely. And there are also organizations doing amazing work, providing aid, talking to people, working for peace. You can support them, donate, volunteer, whatever you can do.
This has been really eye-opening. It's sad to see how much suffering this war has caused, but it's also hopeful to see people trying to build a better future.
It is. And even though things look bad right now, it's important to have hope. Peace is possible, even if it takes a long time.
I hope so. And I hope our listeners will join us in working for peace and justice for both Israelis and Palestinians.